a, uh, a cow tag in Kentucky in 2014, and in a unit in Breathitt County. And the scouting led me to elk sign like this sort of huge elk trail that some of you are aware of. It's going right through a reclaimed strip mine. And as you know, reclaimed strip mines have been critical to the success of elk restoration in Kentucky because they provided the grassland habitat that elk need in their diet. And that entire experience got me thinking about what the elk have done to eastern Kentucky and what they could do throughout the Appalachian chain. Hiking through those hills and seeing everything that was there made me realize that there's a lot of wildness left in Appalachia, even with all the destruction that we see from coal mining. And of course, that coal mining destruction has been pretty rampant, particularly through surface mining, things like strip mining, open pit, or even mountaintop removal that you see here. But we've also learned how to reclaim some of that land and restore deciduous forest and grassland habitat in areas that were once completely denuded of all vegetation. And these sorts of places are good for elk restoration. So if we could restore some of these strip mines well enough to keep almost 16,000 elk happy in Kentucky, why couldn't we do the same thing throughout the Appalachian chain and take advantage of all the benefits of that restoration, biologically, climatically, economically, and even socially? The short answer is that I think we can and that we should, and that's sort of the point of this talk. Elk rose from the ashes of the coal mining industry like a phoenix, and we can potentially use them as a focal point for preserving even more of Appalachia, so our Appalachian biodiversity, economy, and culture can also rise again. But to understand how elk fit into all this, we have to understand the history of elk. And I know there's people here that understand it a lot better than I do, but elk, as many of you know, are native to eastern North America. They're extirpated to the point that the eastern elk subspecies is extinct as far as scientists can tell. You can see the date of extirpation for each state here. They were gone in Kentucky by 1850. They lasted in West Virginia until 1875. Now that all changed as state wildlife departments began to reintroduce elk to the east. And that started in Pennsylvania in the early 1900s. Kentucky, as you can see, has the largest distribution of elk in the east and also the largest population, something I think we can all be very proud of. Now, restoring elk in Kentucky took a large amount of effort from the division biologists and volunteers, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. And in total, 1,541 elk were released in Kentucky from 6 western states. And this is how they have grown over time to a herd of almost 16,000 strong. Now, as many of you know very well, the elk restoration zone is in Kentucky focuses on these 16 counties, which are in the heart of coal country, and reclaimed strip mines have been critical to the restoration of those populations. So let's take a closer look at those populations on a sort of larger regional scale. This shows the elk restoration areas in Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And I'm missing the new sites in Virginia, which I hope to add. Note the gaps in between them. Gaps between the North Carolina and the Kentucky populations, gaps between the southern populations and the northern populations. How might we fill these gaps and create corridors of dispersal between them, allowing elk to roam free along the entire mountain range and even further north in Pennsylvania? We could do this, perhaps, by restoring some of the mountaintop removal sites shown here in purple. And we can do even more if we restore some other mining sites throughout the mountain range. Notice how these sites help bridge the gap between the southern populations and Pennsylvania. Now let's add in public lands, current public lands. And all of a sudden, things like state parks, national parks, wildlife management areas. And if we add on to this, maybe even some First Nation properties, you have the potential for almost continuous movement between North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and maybe even beyond. So proposing something like this, trying to make these connections between these public lands and current elk populations, have been around for a long time. And they've been around ever since this person, Benton McKay, first envisioned the Appalachian Trail, which you see in red here. And amazingly enough, that's something that actually happened. Like, we have that. People can hike from Georgia to Maine on the Appalachian Trail. And it's not through a bunch of forest everywhere, but there's a buffer of forest around those areas. We set aside that land to make that happen. And if we could do that, maybe we should start thinking about a slightly bigger project to preserve Appalachia. So imagine if we had a restored Appalachian wildlands, thicker in some places, thinner in others, with buffer zones around core protected habitat where elk, bear, and other species could freely move up and down the mountain chain, where people could focus sustainable forestry, ecotourism, enjoy hunting, fishing, hiking, birding over the entire region. And I'm not proposing that we like do a land grab on this entire area. I'm thinking of this as sort of as a target area, which I know many of you who do this sort of thing can relate to. Now, you also may be familiar with a previous sort of iteration of this, which was done by the Wildlands Network, a conservation nonprofit focused on connectivity. And they created plans for what they call the Eastern Wildway, which to my look is even grander than what I'm talking about. But that is great in terms of planning, but it suffers because they really don't have any funding for it. And that's where you come in, because you hold the key to the funds that are needed to make this happen. And I'm not asking you for money, and I wouldn't know what to do with the money if you gave it to me. What I'm asking you to do is to think about this, and if you're interested in it or you think it might be important, to take action and influence your representatives in Congress and use their power to make this vision a reality. Or those of you that are leaders in agencies or organizations or nonprofits, think about these ideas and maybe get on board with it. Now, the good news is that it's already happening, but we could do a lot more if we had more funding and support. Where can we get that money? One place we can get that money is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, at least as a good start. As many of you know, LWCDF uses royalties from offshore oil and gas leases to support conservation projects in the United States. And more than 60% of the fund, currently about $11.2 billion, has been used to acquire new federal lands. And that's a modest start, but it could prime the restoration pump. And beyond that, we have a few infrastructure bills you may have heard of that are debated in Congress or have been, and other legislation that is coming through Congress that could help make this plan a financial reality if we just focus some of the money on Appalachia. So let's say that somehow we're able to convince Congress to do that and we can get some of that money. How would we use it? The first way we might use it is through outright purchase. And this shows the Nature Conservancy's 253,000 acre Cumberland Plateau project, which they announced in 2019, which is spread across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. TNC purchased land that had been timbered or mined for coal and is planning on restoring that land to a sustainable forestry over the next decade. TNC, other nonprofits, and the federal government could make similar investments to spread this sort of idea. So this is all happening now, and that's what outright purchase might look like. Now, you might also know something about conservation easements. And if you don't know anything about conservation easements, you didn't listen to Kathy Terry's talk yesterday, which was an excellent overview of everything that's involved. And I'm going to give the Cliff Notes version for those of you that may have missed it. Basically, a nonprofit or a government agency entity pays a landowner to protect their land, which is legally binding. The landowner negotiates and signs the agreement, but they can basically do a lot of things on their land. They just can't develop it. So they can still farm some of it, they can ranch it, they can hunt and fish, depends on the contract that they put down. And those contracts might be for 15 years or 30 years, but we often seem to try to get it forever in perpetuity. And so you may be familiar with what Kathy Terry was talking about yesterday, the WRE, the WRP, CRP, these sorts of conservation easements. You may not have heard of the HFRP, which is the Healthy Forest Reserve Program. NRCS has this program to protect and promote healthy forests, but only a relatively small amount of land has been enrolled so far. And this just shows some of the target areas in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Budget cuts hit this program really hard over the past 5 years, but we could expand it throughout the Appalachians and develop new ones to set aside the land in perpetuity, all the while allowing landowners to continue enjoying their land as they have in these other federally supported programs. So when we think about doing something this big and this expansive, we also need to think about the potential benefits and the costs. And there's, I think, a lot of benefits that we can think about. And one is why elk are a focus. So elk are a key component to this endeavor because they're appreciated by hunters as well as nature lovers, but also because they're an umbrella species. Elk require such an extensive amount of habitat that when you protect them, you're also protecting a whole bunch of other species, plants, animals, fungi, from lots of different species that we can think of. including imperiled species. So if we look at imperiled species richness, shown here in the sort of off greenish yellow color, and the outline here is just the proposed Appalachian wildlands area, you see that the area basically contains a large proportion of that imperiled species richness. So the elk umbrella can help set aside land for other species that we might not be targeting, and including some species that may become problematic later, but where you can be more proactive about their conservation. Elk are also an umbrella for one more species of animal, and that is human beings. Because as you know, mining jobs have gone downhill for decades, and poverty is extremely high in Appalachia, especially in eastern Kentucky. But shifting Appalachia from a destruction economy into a restoration or recreation economy could have substantial benefits that could change these numbers, both in terms of jobs and the economy that fuels those jobs. So for instance, we can just sort of think about some of the economic benefits of Appalachian wildlands. It's been estimated that about $6,000 is spent per Kentucky elk hunt, just in Kentucky, and that's on a seasonal basis. And that means more jobs. As not to mention all the application fees that come into the division. I know how important that money must be to division biologists. Sustainable forestry markets have expanded and will continue to expand, and this sort of project could help that. It also could help the bourbon industry, which is trying to expand the white oak forestry, sustainable forestry. Kentucky tourism in 2019 supported over 95,000 jobs, and that brought in $1.5 billion in tax revenues to the state of Kentucky. Imagine what we could do in other states as well. And globally, ecotourism has been valued at $181 billion and is expected to increase substantially in the next few decades. And then, of course, there are other jobs we can think about in forestry, education, supporting businesses, and the current administration's proposal for a civilian climate corps that would be used to manage and create new forest habitat. So there are also possible costs that could be involved in this sort of project. There's dollars, there's time, everyone is already stretched.
Absolutely.
There's property rights, there's mineral right problems, and the complexity of land deals that might be.
Best friend or whatever.
Sorry. Property rights, mineral rights, and the complexity of land deals, although TNC, Elk Foundation states have experience doing this. And there's the potential for human elk conflict. Right now, Pennsylvania has a fund for farmers, and I think other states probably have those same sorts of things. But that definitely has potential costs. And then there's disease transmission with CWD that we have to think about. So it's not a perfect situation. There are things we have to worry about. But to summarize, elk have emerged out of the reclamation of strip mines to become a driving force in eastern Kentucky. And they have the potential to be just the umbrella we need to restore the rest of this ancient mountain chain. They can be the phoenix that lights the fire of restoration throughout the region if we just let them. Appalachia could rise again, just like the elk, bringing back the forests and grasslands of this ancient mountain chain, along with their biodiversity, their carbon sequestration, and a reboot of the Appalachian economy and culture that is more focused on land stewardship and recreation than resource extraction. So how can we make this happen, and what can you do? Well, what you can do is to call your senators and representatives. These are the people that hold the purse strings. Let them know it's important to you and that billions of dollars would be useful to help spread this sort of thing in Appalachia, not only for the people of that area, but also for the entire planet. And if you work for or lead an agency, a nonprofit, or other entity, I hope you will think hard about how you could help make this a reality, spread the word, or otherwise help promote this sort of idea. So for more details, there's a website here that has an article I wrote a while back about it. There's also a story map that you may be familiar with, sort of GIS sort of oriented thing that can tell you more information about it. And anyone who is interested in having more from me, any information, or to talk to me or have me give a talk somewhere, I'd be glad to. You can just email me. So thank you for your time, and I'll be glad to take any questions. Sorry.